This is a bit embarrassing because it's sort of I promised that my volume four was going to be the sort of the complete was going to be the final installment of that sort of compendium of an overview of much of my research and sort of everything that I'm sort of thinking about, and I do just want to retouch some issues, not directly but indirectly, just to sort of fill in uh, a small gap, which and I was sensitive to this while I was talking about it, but I'm really dealing with such complicated issues that it's very hard to sort of deal with each avenue as it stands. It's sort of this would do better in a book, in a sort of where I could break it down into chapters and subsections and things like that. So anyway, the thing that I just need to sort of account for, and I understand that it's sort of because I don't directly say this, but I do, in the things that I talk about, you can kind of retrospectively piece this together. Um, and so, and I do give some exploration of this theme to some degree, but I don't spell it out. So I'm just going to try to spell it out to simplify it. So, um, and I'm not going to go into the same detail that I went into, but this sort of is the theme that sort of covers it, is that it is confusing in some sense how I use certain phenomena, or certain, how I use personality disorder diagnoses or labels, or labels of conditions to describe other personality disorders and phenomena, and the ideological representation of the same sort of psychopathology and such, and then how, in some sense, how the one fits into the other and interrelates to the other, and it is complicated. It is very strange. So in some sense, even if people don't have a subconscious because they're a narcissist, they still have a kind of magnetic fluid, in terms of that they have to inhabit other people's subconscious space, and they are engaging with those issues, even though as they engage in it, it's from a naive point of view, um, and also, I guess, to properly get into the issue that I want to sort of just clean up a bit, I'm just going to focus on what is generally conceived of as healthy narcissism in the development of, for example, adolescents and young children that are channeling their so-called narcissism, and how that's healthy development in terms of developing boundaries. So what in fact is that even? So let me just say, like, what that manifestation or presentation of narcissism functionally does. So essentially what that is that you can't have a subconscious, um, until you have uh, solid structures in your unconscious side of the mind, or the inner child, before it becomes unconscious. So the inner child has to have boundaries. It has to have internal um, delineation. And only when that's sort of crystallized to some degree can it even support a stable subconscious experience, as it were. So essentially, before you have stable, crystallized unconscious or inner child structure, in terms of how the belief system is curated, or ordered internally, in a sense, until you have a stable vanity, um, you can't project an environmental anticipation or expectation, or a kind of anticipatory animism, or yeah. So so in some sense, when young children are expressing narcissism, or presenting healthy normal narcissism, um, they are toying with their own belief structure in some sense, uh, and so subconsciously, in their naive subconscious, um, uh, uh, exemplification of what they are doing internally in terms of their belief structure. They are acting narcissistically. Um, as everything that they're dealing with is just a kind of secondary token of, or a secondary consequence of the primary thing that they are calibrating, which is their internal belief structure. Um, Now, once they have stable tethers to environmental anchor points, as it were, or as they have sort of uh, uh, correlated their internal beliefs with exterior environmental anticipation, or animism, and those correlates have a sort of stable pattern, then you have um, the stable possibility of the seat of consciousness um, having a kind of external locus of control. Sorry, I said that. That's what I just said is completely wrong. Sorry, having is in a sense having an internal locus of control that extends over an externalized field, or realm, or sphere of action, an externalized sphere of action. Okay, so that externalized sphere of action when it only has a very pale tokenistic, or representative, almost one-way correlate to structures of belief, um, where there isn't a back and forth between the sphere of the sphere of action, which has been impregnated with a kind of psychodynamic investment, because it has a kind of it's a representation of the intimate bond that has been um, uh, 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 cast onto the sphere of action, um, and there's a kind of merger in a there's a merger of significance that occurs between the inner child and the subconscious, for the seat of consciousness to essentially exteriorize itself into the subconscious realm. Um, uh, that before that has happened, if one is only dealing with the sphere of action as a kind of as a pale reflection of the actual investment, which is only in the internal structure, and obviously in some sense the problem that children have is that they largely just have a superego. They don't have a crystallized inner child yet. Even they're still toying at calibrating their inner child structures. They don't have a stable vanity, and without a stable vanity, they can't comport a consolidated subconscious. So if they are experimenting with ordering their beliefs and their their first philosophy in some sense, and then there ways in which one can experiment in that, in which one is already sort of toying with the consolidated medium of the subconscious. So they're naively um, engaged in their subconscious, or subconscious elements, but they haven't they don't yet have beliefs about how uh, uh, or they don't have sophisticated enough structures in their belief system, in a sense, to uh, have a sense of responsibility, or ethical, essentially their sphere of action doesn't yet track a reciprocal culture of that if that any dishonesty that I might um, engage in might come down on me, or come to bear against me, or will be borne by me, in the system in some sense. So in some sense, the way that the subconscious stabilizes is itself as being worthy of being a seat of consciousness is something of a universal principle that the inner child uses as a conduit to transfer the seat of consciousness and essentially to break the mold of the adolescent narcissistic tendency, which is essentially the until that key is used in order to unbridle uh, the inner child into the next stage of development and maturity, if it ever even does. I mean, under the current culture, which is so festering with vulnerable narcissism, and the kind of the ideological narrative that, in some sense, is a half-bred, subconscious inner child amalgamate, that it has so much unconsciousness built into it and so much, sort of implicit projection. And as long as they have an ideological scapegoat that essentially can be sacrificed at the altar of the cultural iniquity in some sense, it can bear the collective sin, or the to sustain the narrative, as almost like the Mayans, human sacrificing in order to perpetuate the culture. But okay, let me just say that in some sense, even if your subconscious is not properly um, established, let's just say, and and instead it sort of it draws on some strange, theological or theocratic type, sort of mythologizing about some sort of grand fatalistic narrative that allows this kind of this what essentially becomes an ego function which can never develop, because it's just like the kind of it's almost like the arbiter over this confected um, uh, half-bred, sort of collective psychological collective entity, so it becomes like the kind of the hidden hand and the hidden religion, or no, like the cosmic religion of this uh, anyway. The point that I'm just trying to get into describing here is that the subconscious what was the point that I was trying to get to? So I was talking about the ideological version of this. I was talking about narcissism, the healthy natural narcissism of very young development of the psyche, and I wanted to contrast that against. Oh yeah, okay. I'm trying to. Sorry, I'm just trying to create enough example to get into essentially, in some sense, that enough of this phenomena is consistent across lots of different types of cases and things like that. That in some sense, the reason why I can use some of these personality disorders interchangeably, in some sense, talking about how a borderline culture, has this cohort of narcissism attached to it, and how borderlines, sort of inculcate a very special form of narcissism, which in some sense becomes their exported excuse and a repository of convenient blame that allows them to entrench into their own pathology, and in a sense to create a cover story for it and to rationalize it. And so I mean, this is why I think, you know I mean, this will be controversial to say, but a lot of the women that are battered women are in fact very, in some sense, if they accord to this particular stereotype that I'm trying to describe, is, they are effectively borderlines, and in some sense, uh, they have quite a lot of manipulation behind the scenes, and in some sense, the bruises that they wear and the kind of and the environmental story that they cast, you're only seeing one side of the coin, and you're not seeing the abuse that's going the other way. And um, in some sense, the men in that situation are trapped. It's not the women that are trapped. It's the men that are. Um, okay, that sounds egregious probably to some people, but I've explored that particular setup before. I'm not going to repeat it here, but um, anyway, the point of me saying, okay, so what I'm basically just trying to say is that the subconscious, in some sense, can be analogized or um, archetypally be seen as a kind of as the magnetic fluid within society, within people. And even if narcissists, which I still claim do not actually have, uh, in any direct sense, they don't have a subconscious, but they do produce subconscious influences on other, and they do, in some very strange constructive sense, you can make a claim about the kind of subconscious that they are inhabiting in some sense. And if you conceptually construct that, you can use that for some usefulness, in terms of understanding the kind of parasitism that they have. But in some sense, that's almost like a kind of, that's humanizing them to the point to which it's not. Um, if you're going to construct the kind of subconscious that a narcissist has, it's in this kind of weird, kind of naive, implied, secondary sense. And in some sense, that kind of construction only works when you are contrasting it against, the functioning of other people's normal, ordinary subconscious. Or, and histrionics, in some sense, are almost exactly the kind of half breed, because they certainly are aware of the subconscious, but they treat it in a very fixed way, in a very sort of tactical kind of way. Um, and their sort of very sophisticated form of confected solipsism, in some sense, which is only comparable to the borderline in some sense. I'm not going to rehash all the things that I've said, but anyway. So my point is that when you're dealing with the subconscious, because essentially you can sort of analogize it as to the kind of alchemical magnetic fluid, um, that allows me essentially to metaphorically, say, oh well, borderlines are essentially trying to um, indoctrinate people into developing narcissistic uh, a narcissistic temperament, and because that allows them to control them, because essentially narcissists have already seeded the subconscious, or as in they've given it up, they've relented it, but they do need to toy with it in some sense, just in order to confirm the validity of the structures of their inner child. And that, in some sense, makes them very vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that borderlines uh, that's exactly, and in some sense, the narcissist is completely screwed, because they're only fighting, or they're only engaging with half of the manipulation, and then the other half of it, they have no idea how to control it, because it's sort of it's a social game, it's a social tactic, it's a politics of appearances, it's that ego function um, relating to the subconscious, which is so far above the narcissist's field of operating, because they don't even have a stable subconscious, that is just happening so far above their head, that they can't even track that level of cultural manipulation, as it were, as opposed they can only deal with the immediate manipulation of the kinds of envelope decompartmentalization that borderlines do. Okay, so I'm running out of things to say, but yeah. So I mean, this is just this because, yeah, I mean, yeah, I was just thinking in my head. It's a bit embarrassing that how I sort of keep on using the one personality disorder to metaphorically refer to aspects of the other one, and so okay, yeah. So what I'm basically let me just reiterate this point one more time. So, in some sense, it's it's not like that the one fits into the other exactly. It's more complicated than that. It's like, for example, um, in some sense, you could say that the kind of manipulation that narcissists engage in provokes, in some sense, a complementary form of that if someone were to try to have as their objective to have a stable relationship with a narcissist, that in some sense they would be prompted, at least with the not directly prompted, but indirectly they would be it would perhaps occur to them the possibility that they would perhaps map out the clear possibility that if I developed borderline um, a borderline style of engagement, that it would be possible to weather the narcissist and in fact even be compatible without sort of contradicting the narcissist in any deep sort of way. So, in some sense, if you wanted to map out a kind of stable complementary arrangement, that they do sort of fit together, but it's not. Um, but the borderline, in some sense, is the primordial seed because that it is the more complicated. In some sense, it's closer to the other way around. That borderlines, in some sense, will seemingly directly impose and enforce a narcissistic arrangement in terms of the on the people that they want to relate to, or at least some stable support base. Whereas a narcissist, in some sense, isn't trying to get other people to be borderline. They just have certain criteria, and it just so happens that if you were to sort of average out those criteria in a sustainable sense, some kind of enlightened borderline um, would perhaps be able to complement that, but in some sense, an enlightened borderline that did that, that actually developed borderline, it wouldn't be sustainable anyway because borderline itself is so corrosive in some sense. But it is the more sophisticated of the personality disorders, at least relative to borderline, at least relative to narcissism. And in some sense, histrionic personality disorder could be in some. This is a this is so complicated, and it needs certain qualifications that I might not be able to make all of the correct qualifications. But in some sense, the histrionic is a borderline that has been tempered by an internal narcissistic um, proclivity or tendency or measure in some sense. But that measure is not how anything like how a natural narcissist would occur. It's sort of it's metaphorically translated into a subconscious um, environmental projection, um, and in some sense that's stabilized merely by a kind of bandwagon agreement or a kind of cultural um, high status or some kind of standing or some kind of abrogated collateral project of collateral support. Um, which and that sort of, in some functional sense, is almost the summary, or or an aggregated, sort of um, narcissistic thing. But I mean, obviously the narcissist presents itself completely different to that little subconscious element, but in the sense that you can sort of metaphorically, if you were to sort of just say, well, what is a narcissist in their totality, in some aggregated sense, in terms of their subconscious, if they were to be described as a positive subconscious imposition rather than a negative subconscious, sort of impaction, or influence on the so-called ordinary. Okay, yeah, so that's it. Man, yeah. So I mean, that's what I just said is so complicated. It's not even worth saying, really. But in some sense, that it's almost like seeing the narcissist from the other side. It's a kind of inverted. It's the inversion, but it is also the same. So it's like a mirror reflection. Um, yeah. So I mean, okay, I'm not I'm not laying this out nicely, but I mean, in some sense, it is more than what the narcissistic component, therefore, is more than what an actual narcissist is. But it's, in some sense, it's what the narcissist would appear to be from the outside, from a third person point of view. So, in the same sense, when you're trying to anthropomorphize a narcissist, that is the narcissistic piece of the puzzle in the histrionic sort of internal arrangement. Um, so that's basically what I'm trying to say, um, and I do think that it is a kind of valid analogy, and the reason why it's valid is because essentially the subconscious itself can it's so easily accessible. It lends itself to that kind of metaphor because, in some archetypal sense, it's very similar to operating like a magnetic fluid, um, in the alchemical sense. Um, Okay, so that's it. That's what I wanted to get through. And this, I think, is also. I mean, I get confused when I'm listening to Sam Vaknin talk about all these things, and like it was hard for me to understand. Like as it took some video titles even on Sam Vaknin's. I mean, this is embarrassing, but this is because generally I'm embroiled in my own research. I don't really look. I don't read. I don't look at other things. But that when these people talk about vulnerable narcissism, they're essentially talking about borderline personality disorder. Um, you know that I mean, that's a kind of semantic jargon sort of thing, anyway. But it was hard for me to sort of follow this because I thought that, okay, well, if someone isn't, if you don't say the word borderline, I didn't know that there were these other references in some sense. So I mean, already there is a. I mean, I understand that a lot of these constructs also, they don't completely dovetail, or they don't completely overlap. They don't, the Venn diagram is not perfect in some sense. Um, uh, but okay, what else should I say? So is there anything else? There were other small things that I maybe just wanted to straighten out. Borderlines. Hmm. Yeah, and to me that also, I mean, that little depiction that I just made, I think, is also quite useful to understand that, in some sense, the constructively the thing that is causing this kind of cognitive dissonance within people, which is, generally, I think, it manifests as a kind of, immaturity in some sense, and why so many people are mired by this almost, I mean, by this kind of immaturity that they some people never grow out of in some sense. It's because their beliefs become intractable because they are so um, habituated by making um, uh, the same comfortable pattern of error and mistake, and it just sort of, and then they can find a kind of environmental excuse uh, to continue on the same thing, some kind of subconscious fatalism, or something like that, um, some kind of collective sympathy generally, this intellectual self-sympathizing or something like that, and then you sort of create this pseudo-religious excuse, depending on, or a bit of rational heuristic logic, or something like that. But anyway, but in general, so you can understand that I've already said that most people, most ordinary people, have some level of histrionic within them in some sense. And I think the depiction that I gave is quite useful in understanding that, is to understand that constructively it's because they've got a kind of um, they've got this internal narcissistic sort of embodiment which is directing um, a kind of unconscious force. So essentially, their ego function is functioning in a very superficial sense, in a very nominal sense. They have an ego function, and it's essentially being directed by this narcissistic component, um, which essentially has is still has its seat of consciousness in the inner child, and the subconscious has not inherited the full seat of consciousness, obviously, and that's the cognitive dissonance, is being strewn between those two things, and then the puppet strings that are being pulled by the narcissistic component is forcing the whole subconscious matrix into uh, cognitive dissonance. Exactly that. But derangement, misalignment, um, selective memory, confabulation, um, you, you know, uh, uh, you know, it's amazing that the kind of the immediate memory loss, the kind of how bits of cognition are simply unreferenced, seemingly unrecorded, because they're cordoned off because they are dangerous to the narcissistic component, and the continual puppet strings that are being pulled by the narcissistic component, and that is the architect essentially of the cognitive dissonance, and it's usually very good at enslaving the entire system. And then the sympathetic component, which is essentially the lie, the fraud, that the subconscious has a kind of independence, um, that is trying to pretend in the social game that it has a kind of good faith about what it's doing, that it has that it holds the keys to the seat of consciousness in some sense, and that it's not being um, that it can reason out everything out loud, that it is putting everything on the line in terms of its cultural engagement, that it doesn't have and then essentially how it makes up for this is that how it keeps that dirty secret of the narcissistic component swept under the rug, is that essentially it grows a moral certitude about, essentially it fabricates a narrative that the ego function is prone to, and that narrative is used to cover up symmetrically the internal cognitive dissonance and the internal cognitive fraud, intellectual fraud in some sense, um, in that the seat of consciousness is not unified, it is fragmented, it is deranged, um, and that might even be part of the intellectual self-sympathizing excuse narrative that allows them to sort of say that, okay, well, my ego function is good enough, um, that there's no internal work that I have to worry about, because this ego function, it's got me covered. It's a really good one, and it might have a but I can easily excuse any of its technical shortcomings, and its technical shortcomings are not like the shortcomings of others. So it's sort of, it has this kind of comparative, sadistical, that kind of I can't remember the word I was going to use, but like it has that kind of sentimental motivation attached to why. Essentially, it's a uh, it's a decent game that underwrites the kind of the moral certitude, and or the I mean, moral certitude is usually how it's expressed, but you know it, I would just call it a kind of secret epistemological chairmanship, that it is the spokesperson of the veiled truth, um, and that essentially it's the matrix, which the subconscious matrix, is itself the kind of, is indistinguishable from a kind of from the veiled truth which the ego function provides, and sort of, and that you just believe that your subconscious matrix is completely parallel and tethered to the veiled truth, and that your subconscious matrix is conferred directly from the veiled truth, and the ego function is just simply there to rationalize it. It's just a kind of post hoc, um, uh, uh, even a kind of usually it's a stupid kind of logical constitution of sort of it's sometimes they're even not ashamed to say that, oh yeah, no, this rationalization was provided post hoc, but what else is there? um, there's not, because essentially they would only take an alternative if it was the same, if it was doing the same thing anyway, because they've already committed themselves to the form. um, and so I mean, that's what you get when you proceed from shaky premises, and then when you don't essentially invigilate one's own. Yeah, I mean, so it's strange because essentially it's just a mirrored inflection of the internal dishonesty that's gone on between the inner child and the subconscious, and so then you just get this cerebral ideological narrative, that mirrors that same internal dishonesty. So it's kind of, it's a metacognitive dissonance in some sense, and it can sustain itself by finding a kind of sadistic target, uh, from sadistically being able to to infect targets with its claim of superiority. And so in some sense it's trying to find, in the same way that narcissists need external verification, the histrionic needs to wreak havoc on others, uh, so as to vindicate the kind of the internal dominance. I mean, it's more it's not, because it's not just internal dominance. It's also like a strange kind of stasis, and I mean that in the Greek sense, that it's tense. It's a tense stasis. It is a frozen war, uh, and it's psychically uh, in some sense, I guess how I would describe the stasis the most would be that it's listless, and it needs to find supplementation in order to in order to keep the listlessness of this narcissistic component stabilized, and to keep the listlessness unconscious, they have to feed it with a kind of sadistic fuel. They have to exercise a sadistically edged sort of translated into the ego function. So it has to be sort of cerebral. Um, and then, you also get emotional. I mean, there are just cerebral histrionics. There are also emotional ones, which, essentially, I often say that there are sort of three things. There's ideology. There's like ideology, almost like political ideology, which is the three main things. It's sexuality. It's like liberal philosophy, and I can't remember what the third thing was. But anyway, like those are the three basic spheres. Or maybe they're just two. The two basic spheres in which um, this kind of false ego subject matter likes to is the contents with which false egos like to fudge their circuitry. So the imagery that the emotional circuitry is connected to. When I say emotional circuitry, I don't just mean emotions, I mean cognitive inflection. So like the thought patterns themselves have to attach to scenarios, and those scenarios in some sense are a kind of almost political philosophical thing that usually involves some kind of, they relate to liberal philosophy in some sense, even if they seem not to in some direct sense. But like in some sense you can imagine that. I mean, even the phrase rationality rules, you can see how at least you could say that that's vaguely in the area of liberal philosophy. I mean, in some sense it's a um, uh, it's an attempt to displace liberal philosophy. It's an attempt to sort of to find an alternative. Um, it's an attempt to subvert um, liberal philosophy, and also to parasitically extract from it as well, or to find a way to subdue it and to dominate it. So yeah, so I mean that's just an example, and then you have here's another one, and I said sexuality. So I mean, like the all the Black Lives Matter sort of stuff, all that racial stuff that's been. I mean, it did start with third wave feminism, as it's called or something, but the whole identity politics stuff, which to my mind is just, it's indistinguishable from Nazi philosophy. It's ethno nationalism based on the identity in a kind of transnational worldview. Um, but and it has this totalitarian edge to it. But in some sense, the reason why it was able to infect the culture was because it attacked sexuality, and because you see, like if you just have a political theory, if you just have a political argument that's secular, let's say that's commensurate with like liberal democratic discussion and secular politics, that's fine. But if your argument in some sense is the gateway to sexual energy, because you're actually saying that no, we live in a rape culture, and like and sexism is rampant, and essentially you deprive people a way to humanize the other gender, the opposite sex. If you in some sense create a filtration system where they are not allowed to engage with one another except through this political conduit that you are ideologizing and sort of creating a narrative, a political narrative around, you have essentially sequestered sexual energy from people. You have put your locks onto it, your ideological and so as this has grown, it's been able to essentially quite opportunistically be prone to. I mean, naturally, obviously, it was women were more prone to picking it up because they already existed in such a privileged position within society. Like people are so deranged that they don't even understand, how society is structured and how good women have it. How much better off they have it than men. Um, you know, the, because essentially they've been so disorientated by this kind of ideological scapegoating, and uh, people forget how easy it is to create a self-sympathizing, self-referencing claim to victimhood. You know, and how easy it is to really, I mean, it doesn't take long. I'm not going to do it here. To have a whole story about how essentially men and boys have always had essentially the raw deal. Um, and we were actually going towards real equality in the 90s, but that actually started, that is almost what I think triggered women to react, is that they were actually going to start to lose their ill-gotten gains in terms of the gender asymmetries, that they were going to have to start giving up some things in order to actually have um, an egalitarian in terms of sexual relations, an egalitarian um, cultural milieu, and they didn't want to step into that, and instead they cried wolf essentially, and they concocted this whole historical hologram and projection of their lived experience. It sort of it literally is like having listening to Nazis complain about the Jewish conspiracy. Um, you know, in a sense, trying to make these arguments of superiority that are based in a kind of inherited um, claim for social injustice, that somehow their gender has inherited a claim of social injustice for things that haven't even happened in people's lifespans. You know, it's this it's sickening. I mean, how deranged can you be to sort of buy into these oversimplified generalizations where you're going to generalize about history in order to do something in the present? I mean, it's intellectually bankrupt. But anyway, I mean, because they've able to essentially leverage sexuality, uh, they've been able to essentially get people to bend the knee right from the start. They've been able to um, get the feeble-minded, essentially the extroverts, the cerebral histrionics, to to acclimatize themselves to this cultural conditioning, as it were, and to go along with the tide of it, and the currents of it, because if it's part of the zeitgeist, it's part of the culture. Um, they're used to plugging into things. They're used to being chameleons. I mean, they don't like changing, but they will gradually change in order to what's the word, to entrench their social status, or to increase the reach, or something like that. Anyway, I don't want to rehash too much of these sort of overarching things, but because I'm not giving the full argument. I mean, there's a lot more I could say in support of the claims that I make, and I'm not trying to make full arguments here. I'm just surveying the psychological thing. Okay, I think I've covered everything. At least you see the histrionic, in some sense, actually believes in the ego function. They believe in their own ego function. At least in some sense, they're true believers, and they might be cynical and at least they appear to be true believers in some sense. Borderlines can't claim to be true believers, or at least they can't for the same people for too long, because they flip flop too much. They you know. So it's very hard for someone to pretend that something was their real face, and then they drop the mask, and then they want to use the mask again. It's like, sorry, it doesn't work like that. Um, but yet they still do try. They still do try to recycle their masks. Borderlines do. At least histrionics have the very, they will slowly work on the same mask. A histrionic will slowly update their mask and gradually adapt it in some sense, and they will have one mask, whereas the borderline has a multitude of masks. And in some sense, in some technical sense, it's more complicated than that. The histrionic, you could say, has a few masks that look very, very similar to one another, and if you catch them putting down the one mask and putting on the other mask, they will try to rationally defend it, and they won't bat an eye. And in some sense, they appear to really believe that justification and that glue that they'll give to switch between their internal masks. And in some sense, people aren't supposed to notice that they're switching between this internal array of masks. And that's essentially how they create the confusion in their targets, in some sense, or how they can project superiority over them by implicitly deranging what their interpretation of the other person's input. And this is the kind of thing that you see in rationality rules, which is why I'm always, I don't watch any. I mean, like, it's painful for me to have to look at any of his content. It's just infuriating. I mean, there was this one person who had an interesting philosophical thing, and he had a conversation with him, and I remember I left a very long comment as to exactly why those issues that were dealt with were just, I mean, he's just poison. I mean, really, it's a waste of time. But I mean, that was interesting because in some sense, to watch someone who, you really see the brittleness of it. It does disgust me. It does upset me slightly. But yeah, and I wouldn't have watched this except Stefan Molyneux was in it, and I knew that it was going to be a shit show. So I just felt somewhat, well, here's an opportunity also to actually specifically delve into the mechanics of a histrionic example, and at least it'll give me some illustrative substance to exemplify some of my psychological research. So I just took that opportunity. Okay. Yeah, so that would finally be it, I think. And then I already said in the comment, not a comment, in the I need to do like 4 different things now, and then I can finally say that I've done my work. So I'm going to make a video on the structure of the 17 model. I'm going to make a video on the structure of the 12 model. I'm going to make a video on the structure of the emotional tones, the cognitive inflections, which is 24, and then I'm going to have to make a video, maybe the same video that goes into the subset of the 24 emotional tones, and then I'm going to have to make a video on the structure of the false ego complex in the metagram model, and then and the different circuits and how the emotional tones populate the false ego model, the metagram false ego model, and then I'm going to show the theoretical speculation in some sense, and the overview of how the 17 model can be overlaid onto the false ego metagram model, and the correspondence between the 17 model and the false ego model, and that that's the weakest part, really. But I mean, you'll see because the 17 model, it's not so weak. I mean, which the best evidence that I have of the 17 model, um, being relevant to the false ego model, the metagram false ego model, is the four sides of the mind model as well. So I'll mainly be going over the four sides of the mind model and show. So it's my four sides of the mind model, and there are 17 types. So I have 17 four sides of the mind types. There are 17 meta types, and there are 48 metagram types. And also each 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 metagram, therefore, will also have a four sides of the mind meta type, one of 17, and then there might also be some speculative things about how to integrate those two things, because there might be ways in which then you can take the elements from the metagram type and plug them in with the meta type four sides of the mind. All these things sound so disparate. I mean, I guess the only thing that I mean, psychometrically, I mean, to me, it's amazing because it is fucking descriptive and it's fucking detailed. You know, it goes into the minutiae of cognition, and you know, in terms of a predictive, you know, I mean, the problem psychometrically, it would be tough to even deal with all the. Oh no, actually, I mean, if you just break down each one as it goes, but the problem is the current psychometry. They're using metrics which are approximate by definition, and because they're so, in a sense, vague to begin with, that they can ask many questions and just tally up, you know, quantitative sort of things when you're trying to specifically locate interior states in a complicated array of many possible alternatives. It might not be possible to have to have tests, the self tests. It might require psychologists administering them, but anyway, that's not neither here nor there. But but yeah, a lot of these things are standalone. Yeah, the metatype is. I mean, the problem is that actually, if you impose the 17 model onto a metagram circuitry, it's not useful. In fact, sometimes even the metagram circuitry itself, it's questionable how useful it is, because that is a complete overview of someone's cognitive behavior, but people aren't fluidly cycling within their cognitive behavior. They have further layers of dysfunction on top of that, where they are stuck in terms of certain structures that model shows the it's like, let me make a horrible mixed metaphor probably. It's like if you have a maze that you can see from the top down. No, let me not say that. yeah, I can't. I don't even want to make a stupid analogy. Hmm. I've explained this stuff before, and there's no point in reiterating it. Anyway, I mean, it's very complicated. So I guess I'll just say something embarrassing. Yeah. So in some sense, the metagram type, the content of the metagram type tells you uh, the particular parts involved in something, but those parts on their own are already in their particularized instantiation within a particular person. There will be developmental problems that arise that will be contained by the component parts to some degree, or outlined by the component parts to some degree, but the level to which that they can impinge on one another and create internal feedback is going to be particularized. So it's like you might know that a certain car from a certain make has certain components rather than other components, but if you say, well, how does that car break down? Well, there are a million ways in which it breaks down still. There are a million ways in which the thing goes wrong. So in some sense, it can tell you in some ideal sense, like how it might function, but it doesn't tell you how it necessarily dysfunctions, and how it dysfunctions is will almost be a kind of universal pattern of how these things go wrong, but they're going wrong with different things, with different components. So yeah, that's basically the so even the metagram circuitry itself, I would say, only actually becomes accessible with something like the four sides of the mind model. So, this is why I was, I guess, uh, out in the dark for so long, because I had congratulated myself for developing um, the metagram model, and knowing essentially how the metaphysics of everything function from the 17 model, um, and the metaphysics of consciousness, um, and then still not working out exactly, well, uh, what have I even recorded? What is the false ego? Uh, 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 do these circuit diagrams not hold the pathological uh, um, charge? And in some sense, they do, but they're not. They don't describe what the pathology is. They just describe what. Yeah. Okay, I think I've just said it there, so I'm not going to elaborate further. And even now, maybe I've even speculatively gone too far in terms of, I mean, saying that the false ego is not pathological. It's the fact that it doesn't cycle fluidly. That if it were just to be able to cycle itself in a kind of sustainable equilibrium, that in some sense it wouldn't be problematic, and in some sense that could be also what is on a technical level being described in terms of the spiritual process of salvation and redemption. Because if you are actually actualized in the sense that your false ego is forgiven, then it doesn't even matter if it is functioning in the okay. I'm not giving this description such beautiful. Yeah, I would have to talk a lot just to clean up what I've just said quite horribly. But anyway, um, let me just stop talking. Okay, so that's everything. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to. This is a slightly new topic, but it's relatable to my last recording, um, on that kind of histrionic on describing um, histrionic forms of immaturity, or uh, sort of the internal, you know, the internal geometry between essentially the cognitive dissonance between the inner child and the subconscious, which then is mirrored or is reflected in um, a kind of incoherent, fudged arrangement between the ego function and the subconscious. Um, that kind of gives the room and the space for a kind of a narcissistic operation, in some sense, to be covered by uh, a symmetrical and parallel complementary umbrella of sort of covering that up from the sort of some sort of sophisticated ego function, um, sort of dark art of creating a kind of deluge, or a kind of uh, a certain confection of conflating and convoluting some issue with the subconscious, essentially, which creates a kind of vortex that particularizes a subject matter to the point to which that you know you you in some sense threaten the other person from being able to, like, talk about it on the level of belief, or talk about it um, uh, to use reason instead, uh, you, you you force the interlocutor or the other person uh, from undermining that confection by essentially um, holding them hostage um, to some kind of heuristic that has a kind of subconscious implant value, that it's sort of it's a part of a cultural phenomena, and you essentially sort of vaguely threaten the other person from that they're going to look bad if they stray too far from that script, as it were, that they stray too far from the heuristic, that you sort of compel them and enforce them to have the heuristic imposed as the standard, as the kind of standard. Now this creeps into a lot of thinking. This I'm sort of technically describing the psychological underbelly of cognitive dissonance in some sense, and I just wanted to point out where this uh, uh, people usually tolerate this to some degree. They learn to tolerate it. They have been enculturated um, to coping with it, and just sort of acceding to its power. And this is, I think, also a level of this is why conservative thinkers in general uh, look incredibly stupid when they seem to sort of when they kind of get tired and cowardly in some sense, where and they look very intellectually defective when they engage in this kind of cowardice, where essentially it's too much for them to reason from first principles everything, and in some sense uh, they stick out a bit. They stick out from the zeitgeist, from the current tide of the intellectual zeitgeist, because they understand something about what works, and they kind of want to reason things from first principles. But they're sort of contending in an increasingly toxicity of a culture that is addicted to the itching ears and the and the rallies of hyperrealism, and these sort of these subculture bubbles of these sort of queen bee relativistic subcultures, or that insulate and make safe um, their feeling of epistemological unassailability. That they have this supreme authority, and that their currency of external locus of control, of tokens, of icons and such, of a convention of idolatry that anchors their external locus of control, essentially. Um, that conservative thinkers have already sort of forgiven society to some degree, that it has this tendency within it. So it's just sort of you just try and make your argument about something that you know about, and everything else you just kind of try to sort of take the temperature and take the average and sort of take the medium view, and you don't try to sort of rock the boat too much. You don't want to stand out too much. You don't want to walk through the fire, uh, as it were. And when you have that level of sort of lukewarm cowardice in some sense, uh, I mean, it doesn't help in actually doing anything to dismantle the escalating toxicity, um, because essentially you still won't call a spade. In essence, you'll make your complaints, but you sort of you fudged. Uh, um, because you won't actually confront the heart of the beast. It doesn't really do anything. You've in some sense, in principle, you've sort of self-refuted, because you're not going to be able to turn the tide when you yourself aren't even interested in representing the confrontation of the sort of just being carried by the surrounding popularity contests, or of what seems to, and the cultural hegemon at this time is drunk on that kind of history. I mean, it has enculturated itself to the histrionic mob, as it were. That tactic is seen as valid, and even if you can't get along, it's sort of that has been lauded as the human condition, and it must be treated as such, and it must be made way for. It must be acceded to. Um, anyway. Uh, okay, I'm talking a bit too broadly, but anyway, so I mean, I've even seen Jordan Peterson, even when he threw Milo Yiannopoulos under the bus, which he then later apologized for. So thank goodness he repaired it. But essentially, I mean, I'm not doing this to complain about Jordan Peterson. I just want to talk about the phenomena, the underlying phenomena, and to sort of explore it, because it is an interesting intellectual phenomena, and it does exist, and it does plague, let's say, the political confrontation, um, or the political field. It's what holds back a kind of revitalization that needs to happen, which is still sorely missing in political. It will never find a mediated political compromise if people are too scared to actually even make the proper arguments, because they're holding themselves back by essentially by an arbitrary restraint, which essentially is in the power of this histrionic cultural hegemon. Um, it is just going to slow down the actual improvement of the general situation if we are going to recover liberal democracy and liberal values, and stop the fascistic, acceleration of culture. Okay, so the thing that I'm talking about with Jordan Peterson, and I mean, I don't even know the full context, but I can just sort of, I believe I've gleaned it correctly, because I mean, in some sense, Jordan Peterson was in Australia, in a lot of different foreign places, talking to a lot of different television people, and he had obviously just heard the mainstream media say for the millionth time I'm exaggerating, obviously, that Milo Yiannopoulos was essentially a neo-Nazi, was a racist or something like that, or was something or other. And I guess Jordan Peterson didn't want to continually have to disagree with essentially claims of fact that were being made, or being put to him by other people, and he just wanted to have a principled argument. So for him to deploy the principled argument, he just said, okay, well, let me just, uh, you know, in some sense, he didn't make this kind of concession, but I'm saying that this is the kind of the general intellectual frame that it happens in. Is okay, well, let me concede the facts of the matter, so I can just focus on the principle. In some sense, let's not have a disagreement on the facts and the principle. Let's just say that we inhabit the same reality, and then I'll just try to make a moral principled argument against what I see as because I don't need the facts to make a normative argument, and that fails. Um, it, it fails because of the instrumentalism in some sense, but uh, and that really has to do with that kind of that conservative idea in some sense, where you just don't want to fight everything about you don't want to fight everyone about everything. You know, you want to compromise something in some sense, and just to not feel so alienated, to not feel so disjointed um, from the surrounding uh, uh, atmosphere, as it were. Um, and this is how everything goes wrong in intellectualism, as far as I can see, because this is how that this is exactly this histrionic subroutine, this histrionic tendency that people innately have, as essentially it's a way to sort of privately um, sort of move out of fidelity with your own belief structure, or just accede to something that you don't personally know, that you're essentially taking on hearsay. And therefore, uh, I mean, it's understandable, it's human to some degree that, you want to have at least some premise or pretext of an armistice to give yourself, let's say, a currency of good faith that you're able to sort of make some negotiation or some compromise from the other side, that you're able to actually enter into some kind of persuasion, and you've essentially given them a token that you are capable of assenting to something that they thought was your sacred cow, and something like that. You don't want to look like that. You're not someone who will not give an inch. Um, and it's interesting because trying to do this with histrionic people, it doesn't get you anywhere. People that are functioning from this kind of histrionic circuitry, you know, you've just given them raw meat. You've just given them the scent of blood. It doesn't win you anything, um, and that's essentially because it doesn't have it's not even close to thinking. So in some sense, when it's not. I was going. Let me just finish that sentence. It's not even close to being animated with any kind of good faith, um, or intellectual charity, because it doesn't have a functioning ego function. Its ego function is a complete slave to the cognitive dissonance, or is a in some sense. I mean, the ideologized version of the histrionic. So I mean, there are natural histrionics in some sense. They are histrionics by temperament, and then there are people that essentially, I mean, I just call them hybridized because they've literally been hybridized by the ideology, and they've effectively, their personality has been molded by the ideological mechanisms and devices that it has offered them, and essentially it has crafted a worldview which the I mean, it's like the Nazi worldview. All you have to do is believe everything that the Nazis believed, and you're functionally histrionic. I mean, this is why culturally it's not sustainable, because it it needs to have a kind of perpetual civil war just to keep its own boundaries and delineation of reality clear. Um, in the same way that rationality rules needs um, uh, he needs somebody else's somebody else reasoning from sort of first a kind of first philosophy or from first principles for him to deride, because if he doesn't sort of uh, uh, find someone like that to kind of absorb his sadistically edged refutation, and if he can't essentially seemingly get away with that kind of semantic trickery and that kind of and conducting that social, it's almost like a social test run, that if he can seemingly conduct a debate with someone or a discussion with someone and seem to come out the superior, then he has somewhat vetted his ability to sort of fool the collective, to fool the system, to sort of, he has secured his social standing within this intellectual. Um, uh, uh, I was going to say ethos, but I really want to use a word that means that, like, the, the world mind, and his part in the world mind is a kind of, is representative of some canonical dominion over and in some sense it's so well camouflaged that it might as well be the same essence as its entirety, and in some sense that fabrication, or the proof of that is in essentially the social standing that he can accrue, in some sense is emblematic of essentially the sufficiency, so in some sense the I mean, this is what you get essentially when you make rationality your god. Is it's that it essentially becomes, well, can I systematically enforce my uh, this is a bit of an extenuated sort of thing, but can I make this the overriding currency that the can my emulation of the epistemological social exchange uh, within a kind of social economy. Um, I'm not, yeah, this is a bit hard to nail down, but it's like I guess I'm making a kind of a post-structural analysis of the kind of a sort of a reductio ad absurdum, that if rationality is your god, then essentially there's no uh, you can't ground it in rationality effectively. Like, but okay, I mean, anyway, this is a sort of anti-realist conundrum, which anyway. Okay, but it is relevant in the psychology. So, I mean, I was trying to describe the psychological aspect of this. So yeah, I mean, this is why effectively, if you don't have a kind of anti-realist position, um, you can't. Uh, I mean, it really does self-detonate. If rationality, um, I mean, how does rationality fact check? The axiom that language has meaning. And in some sense, I mean, obviously, I know it's an axiom. Don't be snide. It's um, it's about, if you take it as an axiom. Even if you take it as an axiom, if you animate it only through rationality, it's just um, rationality plus that axiom creates a paradoxical tautology that you can't escape from, which means that you can't have rationality as a prime value. And rationality is somewhat an external, uh, some relationship to some sort of external thing anyway. So, where is the a priori rationality, which is, in that definition of rationality, it's a contradiction in terms, but essentially you need some form of a priori uh, rationality, um, in order to do something with the axiom that language has meaning. And rationality in some sense is the same thing that I complain about when I talk about the TI cultism problem. Is that introverted thinking or rationality itself, those things are equivalent. So everything that I say about introverted thinking is exactly equivalent to this. But I mean, basically, the argument goes that rationality does not tell you uh, what is accurate. It doesn't tell you what is correct or incorrect. It doesn't tell you what is right and wrong. Rationality does not tell you that. It only tells you one of those two things. It tells you, in fact, it doesn't even tell you that. It tells you within a particular, within a conditioned set of contexts, uh, within a bounded contextualization or a bounded set of qualifications, and that condition, even when I say that condition within a bounded set, that is not something that is ever permanent. You can postulate such a thing, but it doesn't actually. It's actually fundamentally a hypothetical that never exists. You cannot say that something will be bounded in a set way, because that is always prone to reevaluation. That is always prone to essentially prime thinking. And so, because thought can never be contextually bounded, you understand that already I've made an impossible qualification. But within a bound, let's just say hypothetically, um, and this is an impossible hypothetical, but as a thought experiment, I'll just continue it and just to show you the fallaciousness that rationality has pertaining to it. Um, that rationality, um, if you granted a bounded set of qualifications and a bounded context, it can tell you that something is not self-consistent. That is the only thing it can tell you. And it can't even tell you that definitively. It cannot. So in some sense, all it can tell you is that something appears to be self-inconsistent. That does not mean that it's accurate or inaccurate. That never actually comes into definition. That never comes into resolution. And so, and uh, uh, this uh, uh, misuse of um, reductive simplification in order to think that rationality gives you anything like accuracy is, to put it short, it falls under what I would generally put as the heading of there's a logical axiom which is actually an incorrect claim. The axiom of the logical axiom of transitivity is bullshit. It's completely untrue. It's missing a term. It's basically the idea that uh, usually it's expressed as like the transitivity of equivalency or something like that. Um, and essentially, so it's basically like if A equals C and B equals C, then A equals C. That's basically the law, of the logical axiom of transitivity allows that those steps to be sequitur and valid. Now, the problem with that is that I just said the word if. I said if that, if that, if that, then. So the problem is that if is not enough. It's actually not true that if that, if that, if that, then that. It's actually not true. It's actually if and only that if. That's actually what you actually have to say. You can't just say if that, if that, if that. It's not enough. You have to say if and only that if, essentially, if that and no more other, no more anything else. Because if that and an other such complicated things, then you get weird kinds of essentially, you see, because it's not even that it it would call it into question in some sense. It is that essentially things can become complicated systems, and sort of just borrowing quickly from what's his name? Damn it! Oh, word of, I think his name is Jonathan. Um, Gordon Hall, John Gordon Greenhall, Greenhall, Jordan Hall. It was, yeah, he had a double-barreled surname and then he went to Hall. So I think it's Jordan Greenhall or Jordan Hall, and his sort of his distinction between complicated systems and complex systems. But anyway, so this is the thing, is that in some sense you can't say then A equals C, because in some sense that might not even be wrong or right. It just might be like much more complicated than that, and it's like it's true in some contexts and it's not true in other contexts, and it essentially it just doesn't conform to that kind of binary thinking in some sense. And sadly, if you can't sort of use transitivity, um, what actually collapses is the thing that I generally depict as having the veiled truth that still casts its invisible matrix to order reality in the shape of the opaqueness of that truth, or the out of reachness it is. So in some sense, you can understand that, the village atheists of the sort of, or these sorts of skeptical, rational philosophers, or whatever you want to call them, these bright thinkers, what they're actually doing is they've actually created a deity out of how they know that there isn't how the integrity of being and knowledge is limited, and they have essentially tried to expand that limitation into a kind of medium of uh, stable, regimented, quantized packets of knowledge that sort of are boarded and framed by that ultimate cosmic limit, as it were. And so that they've merely sort of now the problem is that if you don't have transitivity, you can't weave that prime resource that they have. That sort of, let's say that's, in some sense they're just incomplete nihilists essentially, and they haven't had uh, the epistemic agency to have the faith in being, in some sense, to become complete nihilists and to confront that absurdity and to transcend it. So because they haven't gone through it, they instead uh, become the container, as it were. Um, and become in the image of the container, and become the spokesperson of the container, and extend the kind of the darkness that they have woven into a stable matrix, in some sense. And that confection, essentially, this is why they have this weird flux of being both permissive to people having their own semantics and jargon and language, and why they come down very toughly on them for not complying to their style of, I want to use a psychological word, introjection, um, as Sam Vaknin uses it. But anyway, what else do I want to say? Okay, this is me. Okay, I've going all over the place. Okay, let me go back to the conservative. I still think this is vaguely on point to do with the conservative cowardice. And I mean, I think conservatives would, I mean, I certainly sympathize with Jordan Peterson, because he is trying to make novel arguments to people that haven't heard basic facts before, to support an alternative worldview that they've essentially locked themselves out of even contemplating as a valid possible, sort of alternative. And then he has to sort of argue with them about the politics of the day, and sort of blaring, the same sort of tawdry accusations that which seemingly become true just because of their voluminous repetition, that, um, you know, the detractions against Milo. And so, yeah, anyway, so what's my point? Okay, so this is basically cured from just having a broader edifice in which you feel confident that you've argued, or not argued, that you know why you know things, in some sense, that you have. I mean, obviously, it's hard to have this at the tip of your tongue, but essentially, that you have confidence in your in what you contend, in the beliefs that you generally contend, and your abilities to sort of retrace that. And Jordan Peterson is certainly capable of doing those sorts of things. Um, and I mean, this is also sort of safeguarded. And so, I mean, because I do think that in some sense, it's that sort of problem as well that allows for the histrionic to get something to grab onto. I do think that I'm more sensitive to this kind of trickery in some sense. Like, I mean, I could tell in the conversation that Stefan Molyneux had with rationality rules exactly when, the sort of, I could even sense as the booby trap was looming, as the intellectual fraud was about to be deployed, um, that, in some sense, you save yourself by sidestepping it, by essentially by breaking their script, by you basically say, I can't answer that question that doesn't have enough context. And then that at least forces them to have to positively motivate the dilemma that they are implicitly already sort of enforcing and imposing on you. The example of this in the Stefan Molyneux rationality rules exchange is when rationality rules says, if someone says that language has meaning, are they already doing universally preferable behavior? Are they already doing UPB? And Stefan Molyneux says yes and no. And then that triggers a rationality rules of saying, oh, well, you see, now you've just confirmed my contention that you're that you are relying on equivocation. It is two things. When he in some sense, you see, I mean, like I can anticipate and tolerate this kind of trickery to some extent, and you can kind of control for it, and I can keep it controlled to such a point where I force them to actually have to sort of make the argument, force them to have to sort of deploy that shadowy mechanism that they are sort of blending using their specious interpretation, their sort of hydralistic um, attachments to you know to translating whatever it is that you're saying into the kind of the inconsistency that they're essentially um, layering into it by their subjective interpretation, which they haven't made, like a proper positive claim about. Um, this is, I mean, real intellectual discussion of high level minds, when they are engaging, they are speaking creatively. They're speaking in terms of the postulates, and they are allowing each other's imagination in some sense to charitably extend it and condense it in some sense, and to speak about the shape of the limitation, and to speak about, to openly negotiate in a persuasive way to each other's views as to what the the complementary limit of such a structure would be, and what its actual character entails, and what its grasp is, and what its reach is, and everything is limited in some sense. The only thing that isn't is the thing that's capable of evaluating such a thing, which is the agent, the consciousness, uh, the prime thinking itself. The sort of thing that contends something like the categorical imperative into being is late is latent in the uh, the actualized presentation of the conscious being. So yeah, so that's how real intellects actually uh, communicate. And then when you've got this when you've got the inverse of that, which is effectively let me privately judge your mental construct and tell you the effects of that judgment in some kind of metaphysical medium or something like that. Um, and then we'll argue about the technical emulation of such a medium, and we'll argue about the properties of such a medium, and we'll have a problem with semantic consolidation, as it were, um, and conceptual reconciliation in general. And I mean, you can take it from that level, and you can be fruitful on that level as well, but you have to be very sensitive to let's say troubleshooting and trying to, in all good faith and honesty, um, tracking incongruencies. And you can tell very quickly that rationality rules doesn't give a fuck about that, doesn't care about incongruence of thinking. In some sense, he's like, he's willing to concede anything and everything just so that he can get on to ranting on about his heuristics and his reductions, because he doesn't care if there's a mismatch. He doesn't care if if there isn't a meeting on the minds in terms of a conceptual incongruence, um, because he wants there to be a fudged medium. He doesn't care. He doesn't he he's got incongruence within himself. He doesn't have a consistent position. So why the hell would he care if there's incongruence between his outlook and your outlook in terms of, so he just needs the semantics to line up well enough, which is why he so quickly concedes that the other person has language that's of a high enough level to essentially sell it to the audience, because that's all he cares. He cares about making a show for his audience. It's a fucking charlatan's, it's misdirection magic. It's not even intellectual. It's a charade. A charade. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I never want to see it. I don't want to see it. It's a waste of time. I mean, it's not a waste of time in the fact that I'm laying it all out as intellectual fraud, and so it's a good example of that, at least. Um, and it's a good exemplar of how histrionic pseudo intellectualism comes to take over culture, comes to take over academia, comes to corrupt, you know, um, politics, and this is the virus essentially of, I guess people are calling it wokeness and things like that, but anyway, it's important to sort of derive it even in the deepest sort of psychological sense, I believe. Because this kind of insight, I mean, I see myself as, I mean, obviously my whole life is focused on psychology, and understanding enough philosophy to solve the mysteries of psychology. But it's, in some sense, psychology really does have a big part to play in terms of social, um, is interpreting social phenomena or collective psychology, essentially. And a lot of personal psychological pathology is, I mean, we are social beings. The human being is a social animal in some sense, and so ideas and culture, um, and psychology are things that are fundamentally inseparable. And I think, the closest, um, theoretician that I can think of, um, Slavoj Žižek, would probably, uh, I guess that maybe I shouldn't pretend to be such an erudite. I'm not very well read, but anyway. So I mean, I can't even say I've never read Lacan, um, so I can't really contrast it with that. But I mean, to me, um, I still think Marx is very useful in some sense. I kind of see myself. Perhaps I was thinking of how to describe my Marxist understanding of things and my Marxist analysis, because in some sense, I'm not. I guess I do have to try to find a new title. I was thinking about calling myself a post-Marxist or something like that, but that would probably make me sound like one of those hideous woke people, but one of those woke fascists. Um, or totalitarians. But anyway, but the thing that the author that I wanted to point out is Bakunin. I think Bakunin, in his sort of um, in his understanding of society and power and authority and psychology, I think you know uh, that's probably and he was a I mean, I don't know how people characterize him as a sort of anarchistic uh, kind of anyway. I guess I shouldn't really be talking about other people whose ideas I have not thoroughly examined, but I do think that that's the kind of school of thought, at least, that I probably resonate with. But anyway, and Marx had very interesting insights in commodity fetishism, and I mean, the histories that they did were so. That is something that I need to get read up on, perhaps. I know such sparse bits, but the histories that Engels and Marx produced are probably worth surveying. Actually, I need to see if I can get a hold of that. Anyway, let me stop this embarrassing recording. Yeah, so I mean, when I say conservative thinkers, I'm sort of, in some sense, the edge that conservative thinking has in terms of political philosophy is that it it it, is sharp in the sense that it's willing to make pragmatic arguments in the subjective immediate experience, or in the subjective immediate purview over experience and over history even, and essentially to reason things, uh, to reason looking backwards at experience, uh, uh, what things are important to conserve. And so it's rationalizing things from first principles, and sort of um, contending a consortium of values and beliefs that sort of is a system of functionality, is a system of complexity in some sense, that they are trying to conserve. And so they are reasoning this from principles, um, in the present in some sense. And they're contending things in the present, and then essentially, as soon as they sort of take some shortcuts in not being willing to do this about every issue, about every principled, ethical thing or any political issue, and they essentially want to make their job easier, so they just sort of cede some ground on some issues, on some topics, because the it's not the aspect that they want to emphasize at the moment. So you can see that so-called liberals, in some sense, have always given themselves permission to play fast and loose in sort of fabricating a kind of pertinence, or what is more salient in terms of the proper propaganda to put forward in the current context of the current zeitgeist, in some sense. And they don't even apologize for it. They just kind of tailor the entire narrative to sort of naturally facilitate the gravitas that they wish to channel, in some sense, as they corrode against the functioning of any kind of system. Whatever you want to call this, progressive liberal. I mean, it's not classical liberal thinking. It's just a kind of histrionic, sadistically edged form of sort of conduit of self-aggrandizement and moral gainsaying and sort of sanctimonious moral certitude, um, in a kind of in the secondary intellectual culture, but that in some sense, when conservatives are faced with that kind of foe, that they are willing to sort of fudge their own principles so that they can just try to focus on a section of issues that is already being preemptively attacked, and aspersions are being cast against it by this incredibly weaponized, sort of metastasized so-called liberal political, histrionic, intellectual culture. And so, I can see why people make these sorts of concessions, why they can sort of throw people under the bus, because they want to make a token of intellectual good faith, in some sense, in order to create a present context in which, it's okay to actually make concessions, and let's just have a good faith conversation. But that isn't even happening in the first place. That's not even, the conservative trying to sort of to to usher the way into that kind of intellectual exchange does not make it so. And in some sense, by just making any concession, um, it it almost proves already that in principle the so-called conservative has already bent the knee, has already conceded the entire, has subordinated themselves um, to the ideological game that is being plotted and played against them. And I mean, you can see this as well. I was looking at Eric Weinstein's Twitter feed, trying to get onto his Discord server, which I always miss the invite. It's very annoying, because they expire within 24 hours. Um, and he linked some speeches from people, um, and one of the speeches that he showed was someone who's projecting a lot of emotion, and then basically the outline of what he said essentially is: don't protest, don't riot, go into your home, don't burn down your homes, go into your home and sort of plot and organize and plan and talk to people and think about these issues and think about how to solve them and use your vote and use your local voting, and and he gave some sort of progressive things that have worked in the past in terms of uh, the better way that Atlanta has been managed in some sense, in terms of not having cash bonds and decriminalizing marijuana, and that essentially creating huge positive um, changes, and what is to be done about the racialized police brutality. And I'm afraid that all of that emotionality, in some sense, and this idea of go, if you actually followed his prescription and you actually went home and you thought about, okay, how do I solve this? How do I solve this? And then you actually sort of realize, actually, if you just look at what the problem even is, uh, it's hard to call it. I mean, it certainly is police brutality. That is not what is being protested. What is being protested is genocide. That kind of is racial systemic oppression, which is also actually what this speaker did mention, systemic oppression. And as far as I can see, this is an emotional narrative that essentially is exactly this kind of histrionic, self-propelling, self-fulfilling prophecy in some sense. And on the basis of that sort of false prophecy, it's ironic because then you get these sorts of overreactions, which in some sense are meant to inspire the thing that it's complaining against, um, in order to almost justify uh, uh, the belief in the narrative in the first place. So it's sort of like it's a self-confirming narrative in some sense that, and it also doesn't ever facilitate any kind of de-escalation. Um, in fact, it normalizes a form of unsustainable, vulnerable narcissism and a kind of further cognitive dissonance that makes it impossible to ever actually look at things realistically. And how many bad policemen have killed white people under similar circumstances? So as soon as you sort of remove the emotional baggage to this, and the optics, as it were, and you look at the statistics at all, and you just realize how insignificant uh, uh, this is in a nation, in terms of, like, obviously it's a tragedy for the family, for but to call this, you know, the idea that this is emblematic of systemic oppression. I mean, this is emblematic of the obsession with identity politics and the toxic culture of identity politics, and the hysterical hyperrealism uh, of the media framing things because they don't have, um, if they were forced to report on things like this in a way in which uh, to enforce some, let's say, quantitative measure of balanced reporting, so that obviously you can't tell people what they can't report on because it's not balanced. Obviously, you can't censor them. Let's just say that, I mean, as a thought experiment, that you said, you, if you wanted to show that in the news, then you have to have an equal representation in terms of the statistics. That every time a policeman is killed, you have to report that, and every time anyone is killed by the police, you have to report that, so that the public gets to be informed as to, like, the general sort of variety of police, of of what it's like, or the kind of, so people can gain a kind of collective stereotype as to the kind of things that are involved and the kind of engagements, or the kind of incidents that occur around police, that fairly resemble the statistical field. And then, let's see how the public respond to something like this, which is in some sense, you know the names of, whenever this happens, you know the name of it, and you know, like how many times, you know, like how often do they even come around, really? How often does this supposedly happen? Because I mean, if you just look at the failure rate of policemen in general, you know, because I mean, in terms of mistakes or bad policing, like and causing deaths, you know, like I mean, if you look at the racial uh, decomposition of that total figure, and then you compare that to the total population, I mean, if anything, the mistakes that are done in reference to people of color, it's underrepresented relative to the crime statistics. So, like, how is this not a fabrication of a media driven operation? You know, I've said this stuff before, I hate repeating, but anyway, this slightly triggered by this because everyone sort of has to go do this dance where they sort of have to feed into the drama. They have to sort of provide their abeyances or that they have to sacrifice their sentimental allegiance instead of, you know, just sort of quite curtly and promptly just pointing at the kind of the fake moralism and the fake passion that is used essentially to um, help launder this naked political ideological you know, sort of doubled down sort of Ponzi scheme in some sense. You know, it sort of it creates its own aggravation because essentially by um, I mean, if anything, I mean, you really start to see the lengths that people will go to try to sort of animate identity politics as being the kind of the pivotal formulaic um, rudiment in which politics and society is premised. Um, you know, as an overarching simplification of everything, that everything can just be conflated and aggregated into that causal explanation. And so, as you depend on that, it's just you know, I mean, well, you know, this is the reemergence of the KKK mentality of the fascistic conception of society and the world, um, you know, which this is the kind of sorry, I was you know, the so-called liberal progressive mentality. This is how they have always sort of operated because of the I was just all the stuff I was saying at the start of this particular recording, um, of how they don't reason things from the present based on first principles. They reason things based on this kind of environmental aggregated, sort of taking the temperature of the zeitgeist and feeling the force of the tides and the current and sort of trying to align themselves with the you know of this kind of external collateral intellectual support of being part of a complementary uh, uh, assistance for sort of self-aggrandizement in some sense. And so, you know, in some sense, it averages out to sort of identity politics. You know, that's always been what's at the core engine. I mean, it's always been able to sort of disguise itself in kooky cultism or, weird sort of esoteric bullshit. Like the KKK was always founded on that kind of creating a nice little cozy mythology. And it's very, I was going to make this point as well about, like how in terms of the histrionic mentality, how they have these many masks that they can sort of cycle between secretly, in some sense, that they can put on a new face that's just slightly different to the other ones. And they can do this in order to sort of, in a whack-a-mole fashion, that they can duck any sort of confrontation with an alternative understanding or schema, that they can sort of just say, oh no, that you missed me, you can't do what we can do. We can play whack-a-mole with all of our intellectual competitors. We're untouchable, like, because we don't have to have internal coherence and consistency, because it's all supported by the veiled matrix in some sense. It's all validated by our cosmological narrative, which supports our variant of sort of valid alignment within its grid. The moves that we make are okay, stupid analogy, but it's in some sense it can only but sort of escape its hollowness. Like, I mean, to use rationality rules as another example, there was something that I wanted to add when I was talking about how you need something that's a priori to assess the axioms. You can't just say that, oh, as long as the axioms in their bundled packets in a combined fashion are still self-consistent, that's good enough, because that's all that rationality needs in order to find ways to correlate them with exterior features. So as long as all the axioms and values and principles, as it were, in an a priori sense, are possibly self-consistent, that's the only gate that they essentially have, in some sense. And even reason by itself is not enough. It's understanding and reason, and understanding does actually have a certain kind of sufficiency criteria that it imposes, and that kind of criteria is not a positive ascription, but it's a negative obstacle that has to be transcended, and essentially the only thing that I think actually surmounts that obstacle is epistemic responsibilism. And I always just say the same two things. The things to read here are Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency. That's a really good paper. And then Vasti Ruot's chapter on nihilism, or on, I think the chapter is called Living with Nihilism, or the book is called Living with Nihilism, and it's just her chapter in that book. But yeah, no, I think it's Vasti Ruot, Living with Nihilism, from Stellenbosch University. And she's really espoused exactly what she's captured, the sort of the Nietzschean, the full Nietzschean, the matured philosophical digestion of the Nietzschean conundrums and topics and subject matter. She's really condensed it and distilled it into a philosophical thesis. Or at least she's modeled it. She's got it fully uh, espoused in a solid contemplative model. Anyway, what's my point? Is that so? In some sense, that's how maybe you could say reason imposes that, but it's not even reason that imposes that. It's like there is a metaphysical structure that is implied by understanding. Um, and well, that's that, which is itself a complicated affair because understanding and consciousness can't just be conceptualized. Uh, it can only be performed in the pursuit of understanding by consciousness. It can't be purely conceptualized. In some sense, it is the incarnation of reason. In some sense, um, so understanding in some sense is reason incarnated, and incarnated in the form in which our consciousness takes, which is the only way that we can know understanding, is through that form. Means that the form in which consciousness um, is structured uh, fills out, let's say, in some sense, in a virtual sense, a positive ascription of the organs of reason. In some sense, okay, this is very verbose, but I guess what I'm saying is that the metaphysical dimensions of consciousness frame and subdivide the complex set of features that understanding involves. And okay, I'll just get into them rather than trying to describe it technically. Is that essentially in the conscious mind there are, I mean, so in phenomenology, in let's say a pure phenomenological phenomenology is a great source of information because in some sense it's the only pure source of information. It's the only direct source of information that we have in understanding anything. And so, it's the first thing you have to understand before you can understand what understanding is. That almost sounds tautological, but the only thing that saves it from being tautological is that is the actual operative mind in the present itself, knowing that it has a purview over a present cognitive computation. So you're computing something in the present, and then the other thing that you have is a reference to your own consciousness in the past tense. So you have a memory of present computations. So you have a reference of past uh, computations that were once operative in let's say the foreground. So there's only a foreground and a background. There's no prospective. There's no future. The prospective is a device where one is, in some sense, pretending to model or replicate the present within a hypothetical context. So, in some sense, the prospective, in some sense, or I guess it's actually correct to call it, in some sense, we do have a prospective faculty, but we don't have a future faculty. So perspective is more technical. So perhaps that you can say that we do have a perspective faculty, but in some sense, the perspective faculty is probabilistic, because what makes it perspective rather than just the immediate present computation, because it still is the present computation, but what makes it perspective is that you're effectively injecting imaginative contexts. You're creating, to use jargon, you're creating a hypothetical. So all hypothetical contentions, in some sense, are a mixture of imagination, are a mixture of fiction and reality. So in some sense, you're giving yourself permission to make a present time computation that has objects which are hypothesized. So you've got a synthesized thought experiment in some sense, which means that you have had to objectify yourself in the present tense. So you've actually, some sense, modeled your own present time computation. You've duplicated it, you've objectified it, you've made it a mental object, and then within that context, that special context, you are imagining to believe things that you don't believe, or you're imagining to be certain about things. You imagine to condition things in a secondary sense. And so you've created a fudged perspective in some sense. So the perspective computation, in some sense, is a work of imagination. It is you inside your imagination. It is you subject to your imagination. And then basically consciousness gets into trouble because you can make yet further decisions about anything, including yourself, including your own consciousness, where you are binding your own consciousness based on decisions that are merely to do with this disembodied model that you have of how your own consciousness works. So in some sense, you are impinging on your own articulation of this faculty to compute in the present tense by creating these sorts of these gates and these filters which become habitual, which in some sense become habitual impediments, but you elected them in the first place not because they were impeding you, but because they were facilitating an automated sense of a specialized hypothesized case, that you were gaining access to a contemplative arena that you have habituated yourself into utilizing. So you've created an imaginary space in your mind in terms of a sphere of action, let's just say, or it could be a sphere of action, but this is even broader than a sphere of action. It's a sphere of computational action in terms of the use of your own consciousness. So you have literally derided your own pure contemplative freedom into a conduit that takes you into you could call it your identity, that takes you into some subtitle heading your self-image. And so and you're so used to treading that route to work. You're so used to that commute, that internal commute within your conceptualization, which essentially all falls under the title of self-image, that your self-image essentially becomes your it becomes your future self which you become a slave to. You become a slave to fulfilling its promises, and it contracts you. It literally contracts your conscious computational acuity. Um, okay, so as that is occurring, oh wait, why was I talking about that? I was talking about first philosophy. I was talking about the a priori aspect of needing something deeper than rationality, and I was talking about essentially how understanding almost implies a certain level of complexity of affirming. I was getting into phenomenology as a way to finding out the criteria that one has to affirm in order to establish um, uh, a framework of mental regulation that is itself needed in order just to conserve um, an operative mental uh, faculty, I guess. Okay, so I'm getting tired, but yeah. So the mind itself, most people that you're dealing with, they're are already in quite an impoverished state. Uh, okay, no, that was not what I was talking. I was talking. Okay, so I'm just trying to solve the problem of how to describe the thing that you need in an a priori sense, and showing how essentially, if you just sort of want to fudge it and make the answer that you expect to be rationality, um, then you end up with very short-sighted short-sighted tokens and heuristics, and sort of idolatry in some sense, that continues to ground this confected, fudged sort of alternative to actually having an immediate deep connection, and a deep systemic or systemized coherent reasoning that actually reaches from uh, the ability which is in some sense derived from essentially having to surmount certain obstacles that if one doesn't surmount, one automatically falls into what I would generally describe as spiritual slavery, with what I have called before the false prophet contract, which is the sort of the seed of the false ego, um, which is how essentially the super ego plants an inner child, or the unconscious side of the mind, which is not unconscious when it starts off, but anyway. I mean, in some sense it is, because the unconscious side of the mind is only the beliefs, and in some sense beliefs are purely internal. You know, they're even when one believes that one is acting out one's beliefs, uh, that's very naive. Um, you know, to believe that what you're thinking is what you are doing when you're doing something, is, I mean, there's that, to make that kind of conflation I don't have the energy to treat these topics with the nuance needed, so I'm probably just going to stop this recording. I shouldn't have started. I'm getting too tired. Yeah, I'm just going to continue this some other time. Okay, this is the continued recording, so let me just try to resituate myself into what I was going on about. So, I wanted to explore this phenomena of what I've generally seen as sort of like conservative thinking, which in some sense, and when I'm using the word conservative here, I really just almost mean a kind of sort of grounded common sense, in some sense, that you have to have a working model of how things function, not just a kind of, in some sense, it's not even conservative, it's just sort of non-pathological, or just sort of not insane, or not sort of, egged on by some kind of secondary theoretical ideological version of essentially how to radically improve something, which is not even based on grounded outlooks and visions and perspectives that essentially never get substantiated in terms of actually having to substantiate the structure of their belief. Sort of like in the way that epistemic injustice, how people that talk about epistemic injustice have no philosophical grounding for what it is that they're advocating for. It's really quite sickening to see how hollow it really is, and how essentially it's just plugged into this confected secondary intellectual obsessiveness that they're already so sort of keen to rationalize and align with everything and have everything agree with it to sort of keep the bandwagon moving forward. And I can understand that when someone who sees the extravagance of a lot of that thinking, and sees the sort of the self-indulgence, and sort of is trying to put the brakes onto it, or trying to oppose it or confront it, sort of get some level of fatigue, where they just sort of, they want to make some agreement to sort of have some common ground to sort of, so and then they throw something under the bus. And the example that I gave was Jordan Peterson and Milo. But essentially, the alternative to that is essentially reasoning everything in the present time, in essence. And then I sort of went into a whole sort of rabbit hole assessment of the deeper sort of psychological issues around that, that tie into the character of the false ego itself and the structure of the false ego itself, and how essentially it's a function of essentially finding collateral support for your own internal pathological psyche, in some sense, or the sort of to help find useful ways of covering up the internal cognitive dissonance, or justifying it, or finding some sort of cultural excuse or permission that is shared in and collectivized in some sense, and confects into a kind of collective narrative and a collective project and such. And so, the conservative tendency in some sense is to, I guess, in some fudged kind of sense, is to sort of allow for some level of secondary intellectual sympathy, is to seed something to it, so that you can sort of try to cobble together a kind of good faith. Okay, well, now let's just sort of accept some basic things about external facts, and then let's actually reason from the ground up something. They don't want to start from absolutely nothing. They don't have the philosophical resources to start from absolutely nothing, and they don't have the emotional, let's say, stability in some sense, or just the environmental stability to weather having to fight about everything, to weather having to just sort of say, no, I'm not willing to sort of take that picture of reality, because I don't see how that's necessarily indicated, and even if you were to give me the supporting evidence, I don't see the point of conceding that point, because I don't know the full context, and we can, in some sense, you can never know the full context to anything. Obviously it's responsible to still have working theories, but one should never essentially develop a kind of toxic intellectual conceit where one becomes absolutely wedded to one's theoretical um, purchase on things, that you still continue to have a level of intellectual humility, and one can even contain that kind of intellectual humility even in the face of needing to be to do things, to actualize, or on the basis, or on the assumption that certain theoretical things um, are taken as true. But that doesn't mean that just because you concede to a course of action that is premised on something that is taken as true doesn't mean that it becomes, you know, uh, uh, an unquestionable orthodoxy. And in some sense, it's the vibrance of culture to sort of keep that door open. And you can just see in how the culture itself is not even willing to tolerate the contrarian voice. And in some sense, so I mean, really, the phenomena that I wanted to sort of generally get into is this phenomena where there is a kind of I wrote a note about this. Let me just find the note quickly. The cowardly edge of contrarian intellectual maneuvering. And I mean, it's interesting that, I think Jordan Peterson is a very principled person, and he does think about these things, and maybe he'll think about something like this issue that I'm bringing to the fore, and perhaps he sees it as already being settled. But I think as a theme, it's an important theme to go into. But I would say the biggest sort of contrast would be, the kind of gaffes or sort of stupid things where you see conservative politicians not holding the line. And when I say conservative, I just mean, in some sense, or contrarian politicians that are standing up. Let me not use jargon that doesn't even hold true. So let me just say, not the conservative line, just the contrarian line to identity politics, to sort of opting out of this hysterical cultural, one party ideology that's being pushed by the media, and which has become the propaganda arm of this disgusting toxic culture, which is pretty much fascistic as far as I can see, but and has the fascistic conception of society and worldview attached to it, a kind of ethno-nationalism that's premised in the identity, in a kind of transnational paradigm. But anyway, that when the contrarian, which is often some kind of conservative, or at least branded as that, will manifest a kind of cowardly edge on their contrarian intellectual maneuvering. And it doesn't work, because essentially it already cedes the moral space to the moral authority that the mob essentially has to perpetrate this kind of secondary economy, which is generally involved in sort of the currency of a kind of intellectual sympathy, which is demanded and expected as part of the kind of the moral order, the moral cosmology, the meta narrative already sort of has already been ceded to the character of that kind of, that no, we have to operate within the secondary economy of sympathy. And when you really sort of give the token leeway to that way of maneuvering, by essentially not taking the hard contrarian line, which I think the only person that I can think of that actually is a real exemplar of this is someone like Milo Yiannopoulos. And to the extent to which that, his performances, as it were, his performance pieces, as it were, are meant to be the embodied exemplification of the pure intellectual contrarian position that is not debasing itself, it is not conceding, it is not sort of retreating from itself and making concessions so as to try to sort of, it is the hardest edge, as it were, in this kind of discourse. And I mean, that's perhaps what I'm representing when I, make my standalone video about generalizations and stereotypes, where I'm going into the deepest, darkest reality of the problem, of the practical problem, and showing essentially why in some sense, it's not going to be resolved until the underlying disparity is actually worked on. And so, in some sense, it's a symptom of the cause. It's not a cause in anything. And so, to try to treat it as if it is the problem, um, when clearly statistically it's not even an outlying problem in some sense, uh, uh, to the extent to which that it's been attributed to systemic racism and oppression, it's like it's just, it's only when I mean, in some sense that works, but there's an equivocation that goes on in terms of the identity politics crowd, because then they conflate systemic oppression in terms of some kind of historical predicament, and then they equate it to historical determinism in some sense, and then they completely sort of throw out the cultural element of it, which is not the culture of the system. It's the culture of the subculture that is investing into this kind of mediocrity and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in essence, um, which is in fact what is being promulgated through the theory of systemic oppression. And systemic oppression exists in such a small way, in such an insignificant way, in such an irrelevant way to how it's being leveraged, in effect to create a toxic stereotype about an entire society, to call an entire society to mire it in aspersions and accusations, which are completely, they don't bear out. It's a complete fiction in essence. It's part of this ideological confection, um, and yeah. So when I'm saying things like that, I'm not conceding anything to the mob. And and in essence, I understand that might provoke the ire of the mob to make its exasperated totalitarian, but that is actually good, because then essentially you're seeing it for what it is. I mean, obviously, I can almost sympathize with Trump, who is in some sense having to fudge the line to some degree, because he has to not fall foul of the false dichotomy that the mob leverages in some sense. And so, you know, and in some sense, there is a secular, problem in some sense, in that, police brutality is an actual. I mean, that is a problem. Um, but the idea that this police brutality is indicative of a racial issue is, as far as I can see, that's completely fabricated. Um, there's absolutely no evidence for that, and there's also no statistical evidence for that as well. And if that were to actually honestly be invigilated, instead of being framed that way by this media operation, which, as far as I can see, this is a very cynical move to essentially try to lend some kind of prayer to the Biden campaign in some sense. It's a kind of like a gamble from the mainstream media to sort of create enough of a sort of a moral quandary, which supposedly forces people to vote along the lines of some kind of false dichotomy of demonizing Trump, and then Trump is in some sense avoiding that by uh, by essentially not taking the Candace Owens line, which because I'm just no one, so I can just make my political pontifications as I wish. I can say that essentially the Candace Owens line is much more coherent and consistent, but Trump has to play a certain level of optics in politics, that he can't essentially have such a hard line in some sense, because a lot of the political economy, you're dealing with people who need simplistic polemics. Most of the population has an IQ below 100. That's how averages work. You're dealing with people who have the vote, and they have to sadly they have to move at a certain snail's pace before enough experience is banked up. I mean, hopefully this whole experience itself will be a kind of beacon to the world to show the insanity of identity politics. But essentially, that doesn't happen unless there is a contingent of people who are willing to make the hard edge of the argument, as it were, and not essentially play this feed into the passion of the mob, feed into the sentiment, and sort of concede ground to it in some sense. And so, and so to me, it's, I'm going to say these things. I imagine that these people, if they heard it, would be very upset with me for saying it. But, so I see Eric Weinstein somewhat, because I mean he's of the left and he's trying to sort of reach out to people on the left, so he has to sort of say the same thing where he's you know he's talking about where he concedes a lot of the substantive points being made in this hysterical, unrealistic, from my point of view, unrealistic hedging and interpretation of the real issue. And I mean, I understand that Eric has also laid out a lot of different contemplative models of how to understand, and he's basically implied that, well, there's a lot of misinformation in the mix already. There's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of hurt in the mix already, which in some senses is on a kind of deep structural, financial level, is causing identity politics. I mean, the N squared revolution, in some sense. I think we don't have to be so approximate and vague. I mean, that is a contemplative model, is a very pure technical way of depicting, some of the issues from a kind of deep structural level. But I mean, to me, this is all frightening because there are deep problems that need to be addressed within society. And the only way to address them properly is to have functioning politics. And right now, politics is completely dysfunctional because of identity politics. It's not the N squared revolution. It's the identity politics, a model of politics that is winning out in essence, and it's choking out the possibility of even having secular politics, of having reasoned politics and debate. Nothing can be done within the paradigm that the Democratic Party is effectively addicted to, and having to force the world into the containers that the propaganda wing of the Democratic Party is infecting society with this toxic culture. The propaganda wing being, like MSNBC and CNN, effectively selling the ideology of identity politics. In some sense, it's not that they're not devoted to the Democratic Party, but they're devoted to the ideology of identity politics, forcing essentially the whole political system to give obeyances to identity politics, and in the kind of so I mean, I think we have a political problem, which, and Eric also goes into all these aspects and goes into all these he talks about these things, but I'm afraid that he doesn't specify them exactly, what the problem is. And I mean, the problem is the particular structure of this ideology, which, as far as I can see, is very hysterical, histrionic in its intellectual, mob-like, collective. Anyway, okay. So, why did I get into this? I'm wanted mainly to talk about not psychology. Why was I talking about politics? Oh yeah, because this whole thing is meant to be about the cowardice in holding the line, the principled line, in some sense. And you see, the buffer between getting to the point at which honesty and, let's say, blunt honesty kicks in, and the introduction where you have to sort of concede ground and sort of and empathize with the raw feelings and the passions and the sentimentality, that road that you have to take, in essence, in a condensed state, is that path, is the land, is the minefield that is the mystification, the conflating, the convolution that all oppression takes, in some sense, because we can't just have a proper functioning political machine. Instead, we've got these arbitrary categorizations that fall into these polemics, so that essentially, power can continue to be unaccountable and murky. So, you know, because uh, because these polemics can command this great sentimental passion, um, and they plug into these great narratives, um, of systemic oppression and collectivized, some kind of collective fallen state that that then can be blame can be apportioned for it, and invulnerability can also be sequestered within that kind of emotional political economy, in some sense, uh, because of this intellectual sympathy, which is given, uh, um, which is even used by the people that should be confronting it. And so, it is a psychosocial phenomena, as it were. And you would even see it quite quickly if you just took the hard confrontational line, in some sense. And in some sense, if you said something more extreme and you said, you know, I can play devil's advocate to my own position and say why I can see the other side of this, at least on some ostensible optical sense, like why people would see this, and in their own, sort of in their own life experience, it would have such an emotional reaction to it. But I'm not going to go through the process of essentially having to repeat that soliloquy. I'm not going to have to go through. I'm because effectively it's so unwarranted that it's sickening to just see everyone doing that. And in fact, it's counterproductive, because in some sense the problem is that the mob is wrong, the media is wrong on this, and in fact the media is in some sense the cause of this, that they are inciting violence in some sense, that they are normalizing it, they are normalizing the and they're doing it in some sense for partisan political, um, but obviously they don't see it as a, well, in some sense I would agree that it's not partisan, because in some sense it's just that they are partisan for whichever political group is the herald of identity politics, is the uh, is the representative, sort of has the Führer principle of the identitarian savior, mark that they are trying to sell themselves as. So they are in some sense creating this chalice. They are creating this. They are rigging the political economy to be attuned and sensitive to that particular uh, transaction. And everything in culture is being bent into the paradigm in which that transaction is the right choice, is the correct paradigm, is the orthodoxy. And in some sense, if our culture, we would have canaries in the coal mine a lot sooner if we had people like Milo in the journalistic profession on the front lines, as it were. you know, asking the tough questions, collecting information, and then creating opinion pieces out of them and creating substantive arguments from that collected information, and then seeing debate on that level and seeing interviews on that level and seeing political commentary and defenses made on that level. But instead, we have to walk through the garden path of pretending to be nice and conceding to people's raw emotions that have been effectively manipulated by an ideological hoax and a hysteria, which is there to manufacture essentially political unaccountability and a political economy that empowers unaccountable elite virtue signaling, and I do think that people who in some sense normalize any part of that equation, any part of that economy, by essentially giving space for the ostensible cover that the whole thing is happening in. In some sense, complaining about police brutality is one thing, but that is not what any of this is about. And if it was, then why wouldn't it happen every time that white people were killed by police in similar? I mean, there are even incidents of exactly the same thing happening to white people. Putting the racial polemic sort of quite strangely sort of projected onto this in some sense, and the overreaction in some sense within that context as well, the unwarranted assault of and stereotyping the whole society, because that is the scapegoat that the whole sort of intellectual Ponzi scheme rests on, which ironically in some sense is meant to almost provoke the racism in order to confirm the initial theory of systemic oppression. Like, how often do you have to race bait and then and then be tolerated as if to prove that the society isn't in fact racist, that your race baiting and your constant provocation gets tolerated. You see, this is, the only way to actually have a stable society in which you de-escalate and where you have non-racialism is if you have a mechanism of, well, in my country, which the law was not, the law has been completely betrayed by secondary legislation itself. But in some sense, constitutional damages, because non-racialism is a value that has to be upheld by institutions in South Africa, even though the reverse happens, because the same disgusting racialist ideology and racialist corruption and moral corruption is what, in fact, is being supposedly advanced under the, sort of misquoting the Constitution in my context. So, I mean, it's a very depraved sort of situation, because it also creates a unaccountable government to the extent to which that they can just keep on diverting pressure with this racialist polemic. And the government essentially, which has been robbing the people and robbing the development of this country and sabotaging this country for so long through for their own self-enrichment, and the enrichment of those who are politically connected in this kind of crony black plutocracy in some sense. But obviously, most of the victims of this black plutocracy are black themselves, and that allows them essentially to continually invest in this ideological decadence and depravity, because it's sort of it cleans its own corrupt. Somehow it's able to ideologically clean up its own corrupt act in some sense and use it to justify yet further expansion. As accountability itself gets more and more, diminished, as the country itself gets into a worse and worse state in which it's not going to be able to ever sort of surmount its own crushing debt, which keeps on increasing in essence, as as the stolen money from the looted government coffers, sort of finds its way into these oligarchs, these black oligarchs, essentially. And there's, because black is a protected sort of thing, this goes under the rug. This is undetectable. This ideology is so delusional and disorientating that essentially it makes responsible politics or responsibility within political leadership, it just makes it completely, um, you know, it's too easy to sort of to divert attention because you can just focus on the ideological racket of this virtue signaling, of, sort of saying the right words, and the policy itself that accords to the ideology is itself corruption, because you can just give things to people just based on superficial features, not based on their disadvantage. You don't have to make policy that's designed to target people based on disadvantage. You can just make policy that just targets people for being black. And so you can therefore use that policy for wholesale corruption, in essence, because the policy says that, as long as they're being chosen on the basis of the criteria listed in the policy, that's like good enough. And that is the proxy for affirmative action. And so we've got the most depraved kind of destabilizing affirmative action that you can imagine, which just disrupts everything. And it also, slows down the economy. It makes it hard for anything to actually function with any kind of fidelity or integrity, because this ideological integrity, this toxic identity consciousness, becomes the overarching narrative where everything must be explained and justified through. And so, it's a self-fueling purity spiral into more and more overt forms of totalitarianism and fascism, as is everything else that doesn't function according to that moral, that corrupt morality gets essentially blamed for things not turning out better, for things not happening well. So the problem essentially creates this strange false dichotomy where it's always being undermined by people, and it never is accountable for its own failings. It's never accountable for its own mismanagement of resources and its own unintelligent interventions. And this is the problem that all fascist cultures and fascist political cultures have, is that their leadership become immune to criticism, because the criteria that they're being measured against is the ideological heuristic. It's not like anything common sense. It's not by any sort of common measure. It's by some crazy measure of identity, and identity and virtue within this kind of identity secondary economy of sympathy. And in some sense, you can only prove that you're a good identitarian by punishing other people for not being the just identity or something like that. So you have to sort of redistribute harm to other people. It's not about putting people in a better position. It's putting people in a better position in contradistinction to the other identities in some sense. So the only way to redistribute justice between identities in some sense, or the only way to affect epistemic to do something about epistemic injustice, is by duplicating the epistemic injustice and extending it forward onto other people. So then you can say that there's an equilibrium. So this is the problem in the moral logic of identity politics, in essence, is that it can't distinguish between making an identity stronger and making all other identities weaker so that it's even. It doesn't have that kind of sensitivity. It's about retributivism, essentially. It centers around a zero-sum moral logic between identities and identitarian pride, because it's premised in rationalist in racialist pride, and it rationalizes everything in an alignment with that core premise of essentially ethnocentric an ethnocentric core value. And if the powers aren't separate but equal, then it doesn't sort of and the only way to prove that they're separate but equal is to sort of to have people describing what their harm is, and then having other people compensate by having an imposition of the same harm, essentially, because that's the only way that you can know that it's the same, is by measuring the negative impact, by measuring the by measuring the epistemic injustice and then trying to replicate that and export it to other groups. Which is, I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy, because the idea that that is somehow good for the that somehow promotes epistemic justice. So this is the thing, is that epistemic justice doesn't have a positive definition. They only have a definition for epistemic injustice. That's why they have to essentially replicate and duplicate and expand epistemic injustice in order to reach an equilibrium. That's how unsound their basic philosophy is, because they don't have a positive definition of these things. And obviously, like, the idea that you're going to increase, so they've got this basic premise that if you increase epistemic if you bring epistemic injustice into an equilibrium, that somehow you are increasing epistemic justice. Somewhat correct. Well, yeah, I mean, I've got other sort of arguments as to why epistemic injustice is an utter, is just so utterly bankrupt intellectually. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Yeah, so you see, like, when you concede into the passions, or the sentimentality, or the ostensible thing, in some sense, I guess you can say you're trying to create a common language. You're trying to create a bridge where you can start to communicate, so that people can know that, like, on the outset, that you're not against them, but you want them to think a bit differently, or you want them to listen to you. So you're trying to give them an excuse or a reason to listen to you by essentially mirroring their emotional outcry or something like that. I mean, I can understand sort of the human politics of that, but when it sort of, to me, it very much crosses the line. I think that there's a way of doing that. Obviously, perhaps it sounds too dry if you do it in the way that I'm about to propose, but you do it in principle. You say, well, like, I understand why these things are unsettling. They are unsettling to humanity as just a specific brutal, police brutality is itself, just by itself, it's something that shouldn't happen. Uh, it's wrong in a human sense. It's not wrong in any specific sense necessarily, of any. It's not necessarily wrong in any subset of a more specialized problem in some sense. You okay, no, never mind. But the issue that I'm basically trying to say is that you map out a very clear and consistent contemplative modeling of how you are moralizing, or how you are reasoning with your ethics. And you're keeping that consistent hard edge. You're not giving tokens of sympathy to people, which frankly they don't deserve. And frankly, it's rather like, this is a hyperbolic example, but for example, people that use suicide, the idea of them committing suicide as a way to expand their power and their influence over other people, and to sort of garner attention for themselves and things like that. This is a touchy subject to sort of bring up, but if you look at the actual successful therapies that deal with these things, DBT, how very quickly they engineer the idea of developing and cultivating this thread of internal an internal locus of control, and to start to grow the idea of self-determinism and accountability. And so they'll often say, well, obviously, when you come in here, I have to talk to you about any immediate suicide. If you're dealing with someone like who is this kind of way with suicide, you have to deal with any immediate concerns or thoughts that they have about suicidal ideation, perhaps, or immediate feelings or plans to commit suicide. But in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, they very quickly get into saying, well, look, I want to give you an effective therapy, but I can't give you an effective therapy until you sort of promise that you won't kill yourself for some time, so that we can actually do some skills development and I can give you an effective therapy, but I can't get to the effective therapy if I'm constantly having to put out this fire in the meantime. And some people, they do need to oscillate in some sense, because they do sort of need to test the boundary in some sense. And this is the problem, is that often people who talk about suicide, they're trying to essentially control others. Essentially, they're using it as a form of making their environment, because they feel disempowered. But it's ironic that their belief structure about being disempowered, in some sense, is why people don't want to be around them, because they are so immediately controlling and sequestering of people around. Okay, anyway, this is a broader topic and something that I perhaps shouldn't have brought up, but the idea that there's a lot of manipulative coercion going on in these people's, they don't have proper boundaries and things like that. And the reason why they don't have those boundaries is because they have this very fudged internal view of their self-determinism, of their accountability, that they've put it into a narrative. They've put it into a story, a kind of fatalistic story, or a kind of cosmic narrative as to like how justice works or something like that. And their self-image or their self-definition is, it's what's the word that means that it's perforate, it has it's a permeable membrane. It doesn't really support distinctions that facilitate transactions that are consensual with other people. And so, because they can't preserve other people's idea of consent, because they're effectively are quite controlling, even though they might not be intend to be controlling, but they become like vortexes of energy, because they're so unable to conserve their own energy in some sense, because their thinking is so loose that it facilitates that kind of automatic merger with whatever their surroundings includes. And so it's very easy if you can just latch onto a narrative about your environmental surroundings, or your the story of your life, essentially. If you can believe that the story of your life is what governs your life, rather than your own choices, rather than your own ability to make better or worse decisions, all of that gets thrown into the sausage making machine of the overarching narrative in some sense, or the which then will have categories built into it, kind of cosmic of a moral, of a kind of objective moral rubric, and then that categorization system can be used essentially as when there's an expectation that categorization system is shared by the collective, then they can use that as a way to facilitate a secondary interaction of sort of sympathy exchange, rather than actually, so they're so invested in that internally tracked secondary economy of sympathy, that they can't actually deal with anything else, and other people just have to deal with that in the meantime. Other people have to look after that, and have to do that busy work, and sort of have to, while also putting up with this delusional secondary economy of cosmic justice, or whatever category system that they have in their mind, as to how they order the world in order to allow themselves to be deluded and sucked into this vortex of essentially trying to extract this kind of emotional energy from other people. I mean, that in some technical sense is kind of like how borderline operates, and a lot of this ideology is very much like a kind of collective borderline entity, as in borderline personality disorder. And it's very hard to fix borderline personality disorder. It basically doesn't happen. People with borderline do not get better. This is why, in essence, I think also traditionally there have been so many stereotypes around women to try to stop the proliferation of borderline tactics and borderline values, that at least it would essentially be contained within, like the roles that women were confined to in some sense. And it even gave room for borderline maneuvering, because that ground was essentially ceded to women. And so, women, I mean, common sense women, or people that are sane and non-pathological, will understand essentially how bad some women are. A lot of women will know essentially how bad the world is made by bad actors, which essentially they get to fly under the radar because so much of the traditional stereotypes conceal um, a kind of depravity and degradation, which women are essentially just they're given a wide berth. It's just sort of and it was that, I think it was that kind of thing that was actually starting to come under focus within the general egalitarianism that was developing in culture, that was finally starting to happen in culture, because of the other sort of technical forms of equality that had been achieved. That when the culture wanted to actually try to find a new redress, it just kind of exploded, and we had this incredibly reactionary feminism that effectively tried to reinvent the kind of the traditional um, dichotomy or segregation, and set up special stereotypes for women, in a sense to try to insulate the borderline maneuvering which women have generally, on an ideological, in a kind of, in terms of femininity itself, and the enjoyment of femininity, and the space, the cultural space made for femininity, had a kind of borderline uh, capacity and faculty, um, uh, which is interesting because that's a complicated thing that I'm not going to give full justice to here, because it has positives and negatives, in that it forces the rest of society to put up with that, and to sort of make, and to cope with that, and in with coping with that, society has had to develop a nuance and a sophistication that it otherwise wouldn't have. And it does have also other pro-social benefits. But in terms of, let's say, psychological justice and individual justice, and it certainly has many negative effects. Um, you know, and in fact, one would say that the people who have borne the costs of those effects the victims of that have been men and boys. Um, Also girls and women as well, but to a lesser extent, and to a different in different forms. And those different forms, culture has been very astute into identifying and protecting against, or at least being vigilant against, whereas there is an anti-vigilance on the cost that men are expected to essentially absorb and to cater to blindly, and essentially develop a kind of male disposability, and just sort of, well, you just have to compete, you just have to put up with the expectations and the entitlement, because that is how you prove that you are, so the asymmetry in the sexual marketplace and such, um, something which women sort of they know, and they pretend that something that feminists intrinsically understand and know, but then they pretend also not to know about. It's really quite disgusting, um, how they sort of abrogate to themselves this right to have female privilege, but then they somehow, that's not contradictory of their supposed accusations and complaints against male privilege. It's Uh, it's hypocritical to say the least. And all these things were already naturally being culturally, I think, gotten into in sort of the 90s and the early 2000s, perhaps, until this huge reactionary surge uh, that has continued to erode sexual um, the sexual relationship, or or the relations between the gender, uh, uh, the, the the gender binary, and so because creating this artificial ideological filter on gender relations, and sexual relations, they have found a way to force everyone into getting into the same vortex, into the same secondary economy of intellectual economy of intellectual sympathy, and therefore they have essentially exploded vulnerable narcissism and borderline. Essentially, everyone has become a variant of this, and I do think that identity politics must be seen as what the vector of contagion was feminism. That this all came from you know, even the gay pride. Gay pride was an adaptation of feminist thinking. Um, I mean, that was the first time that feminism actually sort of gave birth to a secondary ideological narrative that fitted the script and fitted the formula, but it was sort of it actually it didn't just apply to, because culturally it had, that sort of politics had always applied to women, and then when it was gifted essentially to the gay pride movement, then that stood as an example that everyone else could then join into it. Because I guess you could argue, you could say that, oh, the Black Panthers had a variant of this before it, in some sense, but that kind of didn't really culturally take off. But after the gay pride movement, then it opened up. Then the ethno-fascism essentially has started to come through quite clearly, because philosophically it's been normalized by feminists, and it's been made famous by essentially controlling sexual energy, because anyone who wants to get into the sexual marketplace has to deal with these women that have been indoctrinated by this kind of identitarian worldview and conception. They have given up non-sexism. They don't believe in non-sexualism or sexism, however it's easier to say non-racialism than, so they have become anti-sexists in the same way that these racialists who call themselves anti-racists are, so this idea of, because when you're anti-sexist, you can't do anything unless you can identify sexism. So it gives this really perverse incentive to, because if you don't deal in the secondary intellectual sympathy, you have no way to navigate. You have no way to negotiate, because you have to negotiate through your identity, and that's what we were all taught in the corruption of the sexual dynamics within our culture, which was effectively conquered by this kind of proto-identitarian feminist narrative, which is another way to say it is this general history on. I mean, it's not as if men have never done the same thing. So I mean, there have always been intellectuals who have thematically the same style of interrogation of reality. Foucault had this view essentially, but I mean, you can see it. It's in the brittle intellectualism. I mean, I've given the example of rationality rules. I think that's you understand also essentially the scientism sort of bandwagon, which existed for a long time, that I've argued against for a long time as being stupid and being built on this kind of blind faith, is the same model of all of this stuff. So the kind of fudged narrative that Richard Dawkins has been peddling forever. Science tells us this, and people that disagree with it are wrong. These simplified reductions of not coming to grips with the philosophical sort of substrate of these matters, of science is an empiricalism, or empiricism. you know, this sort of stupid equivocating, um, not understanding. Anyway, these are other arguments. I don't want to divert too much, but so this is what we're dealing with on a cultural level, and the solution is simple because yes, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of sentimental thinking, and the only way to cut through it is not to concede to the emotional thing. Is because if you can make that stand, if you can actually hold that ground by not conceding to the emotional thing, then you are giving a very clear beacon, a very, very clear model of how intellectualism can work without having essentially to cope with this kind of fascistic, histrionic, cultural toxicity and tendency, which in some sense you can see how in other times, in other epochs, cultural epochs as it were, you can see how the histrionic tendency was suppressed in other cultural ways, in less effective ways, in ways in which it was being contained by a compromise, by a systemic compromise in culture. Now that we've sort of lost that kind of cohesive narrative that at least made us immune against foreign bodies or nationalism in some sense, at least gave you a whole section of things that you could be confused about or have different views on. Some people could really love some foreign culture and other people could hate it, and it didn't matter in some sense because it was somebody else's problem. Because if you didn't like the political culture in somebody else's country, it didn't matter to you because you weren't a voter there. You only had to care. So it gave a kind of a sense of pertinent accountability within a certain grounded sense of boundaries and containers in some sense, and at least the local container would affirm something like self-determinism or something like that, at least in contradistinction to the fact that it doesn't matter what other people are doing. As soon as you have this transnational sort of worldview, then where does your real politics come into it? And now it's been imported and focused in and channeled through identitarian real politics. So everyone still believes in real politics. They just don't believe that it's between nations. They believe it's between identity. And that oversimplification has essentially given political elites and governments everywhere the leeway to do whatever the fuck they want with no accountability, because their policy just has to say the right things to the right identity. They just have a little checklist and it just has to look a certain way, and that's the only thing that they're being shouted at when they're not fulfilling. And if that is their job, they can do whatever the fuck they want and they'll get away with it because no one's looking, no one's interested. The journalists aren't reporting on it properly because the real energy, the real focus, the real emotional charge is all in this bullshit contradistinction between people's epistemic injustice between their fucking identities. It's the biggest waste of time. I mean, this is how totalitarian systems function, because essentially you can't even speak up against your power structure because then you're diverting energy from solving the identitarian problem. Because if all problems are framed in an identitarian mode, it's like, well, everything is part of that emergency, that absolute necessity of having to quell the epistemological injustice of it's this constant state of emergency, constant state of civil war that you see in these totalitarian ideological regimes. And who's the fault of this? It's the journalists. The journalists are pushing this disgusting ideology, this fascist ideology that has just been repurposed and repackaged in a slightly different labeling category system. And they're disgusting academics that push out these historical narratives and where they essentially project history onto the present, where they try to make historical injustice reanimated onto the present. For what end? To what aim? Because it's easy to pontificate, because essentially it's such a simple trick that you can just keep on churning out papers that all look the same, that all make the same. It's political activism is what the fuck it is. I mean, it's political propaganda with a kind of academic sort of style sort of thrown onto it, and it's in the South African context, it's constitutionally damaging. It undermines non-racialism, and essentially they found uh, a way to sort of. I mean, in sociology, there's fucking no excuse in some sense, because then it's just it's sort of so the historians that are doing this kind of dirty business are doing it in league with the sociologists who propound these disgusting things. The race and gender. You know, well, I guess it's more in the philosophy department, but technically sociology is in is social philosophy, or it does fall under philosophy. But okay, okay, I'm just trying to make the argument here that I've made these arguments before, but basically it's constitutional damages. You can't just say, oh, it's academic freedom, it's freedom of thought. You have made a moralistic commitment. You have made an assumption. You've made a moral assumption that this is all based on, and this is all premised in, and it's not fucking non-racialism. And in the extent to which that you can argue that it is non-racial in some sense, because you're actually trying to fix the history through the present, or some shit like that. That's their stupid confected loophole. I mean, it equates to racialism, essentially. It's functionally racialism. That's exactly what it is. Um, and their theory, in some sense, is based. I mean, you can't get away. You can't get away from it. Is that on the sociological theory, is that identity is the determining factor, and they never substantiate this. The statistical analysis that they use simply begs the fucking question. And so they have that kind of wishful conjecture as the kernel of the only thing that they have to substantiate them. So it's like it's a working theory that's never been substantiated, and yet they are effectively, so it's strange how, yeah, I mean, so it is slightly convoluted, because they have taken a model that is functionally convoluted in order to try to sort of semantically disguise their racialism, their very specious form of racialist, but I mean, like, if you take what Aryan studies involved, you can metaphorically track everything that happens in race and gender studies and map it onto Aryan studies. It's just, instead of genetic superiority, they have a kind of the inheritance of the spiritual inheritance of a lived experience, of a collective lived experience. How is that not the same as like blood and soil? That you're going to map everything in society relative to a group categorization, and then you're going to sort of tell a relativistic story about their collective experience and their collective fate, which sort of aggregates into these things, which also then assume that their culture is separate and equal. Which is a phrase that should chill anyone, because that sort of, that's sort of like one of the moral premises, in some sense, of how you can rationalize any kind of fascistic system. But anyway, okay, I didn't treat that topic with proper care, but I do have recordings where I'm just focusing on that. So, okay, I've completely gone away from the main thing that I wanted to focus on, which was cowardice. You see, it's not even that it's not cowardice. It's the wrong, but I mean, it does manifest, and it looks like stupidity or cowardice in some sense. It's kind of maybe it's a bit of both, and both of those are metaphors. What it really is that it's uh, it is a form of obeisance, um, obeisance. I think that's how it's said. And if you were to displace that obeisance and actually get into and force yourself to have a harder edge in terms of the actual confrontation, it opens up the metaphysic of it much sooner. It opens up the raw underbelly of it much quicker. And I think unless we tackle it culturally on that level, it's just going to be more of a doom spiral. Um, any kind of light and air that is given to this very dark, sort of borderline culture, um, you yeah, it's just going to make any kind of resolution less possible. And I do think that we do have to start uh, acting with more haste and acting with more gall and more fortitude, because otherwise we're not going to be able to surmount the looming uh, darkness in time. We're not going to be able to contend against it if we don't get on top of it politically, as it were. Because if we don't have a functioning political system, a functioning liberal open democracy, it's not going to be possible to uh, to get out of the hole that, the ditch that, and the lurch that, I mean, some countries are in a worse position than others. Um, and I mean this, in terms of the finances of the country, the fiscus, the budgets, the general problems that exist.